Good evening. I feel very privileged to be here at the invitation of Grand Council Treaty 3 on the territory of the Anishinaabe Nation. Thank you for welcoming me. Before I begin, I'd like to declare that I've spent most of my career in the nuclear power industry, and that I've also done work for the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, although not on the Deep Geological Repository. I'm not a technical expert, and I don't have a technical degree. The views I represent are my own, although I'm here because Grand Council Treaty 3 staff reached out to Women in Nuclear Canada to request a speaker for this event. I raised 2 daughters living less than 10 kilometers from one of the world's largest nuclear power generating stations, Bruce Power, where I worked for many years. I retired in 2019 and have been running my own business since that time. My daughters and I live in Kincardine on the territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. At Bruce Power, there are 8 generating stations, nuclear reactors, producing about 30% of Ontario's electricity. They also produce life-saving medical isotopes, and they generate some of the used nuclear fuel for which a permanent deep geologic repository is being planned. I hope that context provides some transparency around where I'm coming from in my talk to you this evening. Does anyone in the room remember having to use a public telephone booth? Just a few? Well, the trajectory of my career was forever changed because of an idea that, in my mind, will always be associated with a specific time and place, a moment in space. A public phone booth and a newspaper headline, a time before we had internet news and cell phones in everyone's pockets. I was in a phone booth, a pile of newspapers in my hand. The day before, the company that I worked for at the time, British Energy, a UK nuclear company, had announced that it intended to lease the Bruce nuclear facility from Ontario Hydro. I was part of the team that worked on the creation of Bruce Power, and I was on the phone with the CEO, reading the newspaper headlines from that phone booth. The deal was front-page news. Imagine one of the largest nuclear generating stations in the world being acquired by a foreign company. The media and the pundits had a lot to say, not all of it positive. But one headline is seared into my brain. British Energy must earn our trust. That headline resonated with me so deeply. And looking back, the idea of trust has profoundly impacted the trajectory of my career, the choices that I made, what I wanted to do, both inside the industry and within the public sphere. Inside the industry, trust in the context of safety culture. Safety culture is all about creating a culture within an organization that puts safety as the overriding priority. And when I talk about safety, I'm not talking only about slips, trips, and falls, worker safety, but I'm thinking about broader ideas of safety, including security, environmental safety, and of course, radiological safety. And in the public sphere, trust in the context of my work to build relationships, deepen understanding, and create trust with diverse publics, including the work that I do on engagement and on advocacy. When I joined the nuclear industry, I didn't know much about nuclear power. In fact, I was rather skeptical. I associated the technology with things like nuclear bombs. I grew up during the Cold War, when it seemed like the threat of nuclear annihilation was imminent and decided by superpowers far away. But working in the industry, I came to appreciate the benefits of the peaceful application of nuclear technology. Things like reliability, its low carbon emissions, how you can get a lot of electricity from a small footprint and a small amount of fuel, using less land than many alternatives, and the creation of life-saving medical isotopes. I believe that nuclear technology does provide something worthwhile to society. However, it also creates waste, just like other forms of electricity generation. But radioactivity is the hazard in our nuclear industry. However, that radioactivity is carefully managed and monitored. I know of no other industry that accounts for all of its waste and sets funds aside to manage that waste, dispose of it, and also decommission its facilities properly. I joined the industry by chance. I had recently moved from Montreal to the UK, and I received 2 job offers on the same day, in the mail at that. One from Johnson & Johnson, and one from the nuclear industry. I flipped a coin, and heads was nuclear. A few things stand out in my mind about my first impressions, and these really haven't changed through my career in terms of my perception of the industry. People in the industry are truly committed to safety, and sometimes things move slowly. That commitment to safety as the overriding priority means taking the time to get things right. Scrutiny, a lot of scrutiny from the public, the media, and a very challenging nuclear regulator. Collaboration between companies across the nuclear industry is very high, and this is really unique, I think, in any industry. People critiquing one another to help get better. And it's highly technical. The industry is full of incredibly bright people, brilliant minds, who are not always the best at communicating effectively with the public. The other thing that I noticed was the gender gap. There were not a lot of women in the nuclear industry, and for a long time I thought, somebody should do something about that. Not only was there a gender gap in the nuclear industry itself, but it turns out there's a gender gap in support for nuclear, with, on average, more men supporting nuclear power and more women opposing it. These two ideas are connected. And I did do something about it. I founded an organization called Women in Nuclear Canada, which is a branch of an international organization, WIN Global, started by a group of mothers working in the nuclear industry in Europe in the late 80s and early 90s, whose aims include public education, advancing women in the trades, in STEM and leadership, and promoting the peaceful application of nuclear and radiation technology. Our first meeting had 12 participants, and now there are over 6,000 members in Canada and 85 branches around the world. One of my first initiatives was to get women working in the industry talking with women in the public. I believe that women's talking to other women would put a fresh face on the industry and promote the kind of dialogue and understanding that would cut through a lot of the misinformation people heard in the media. We had the first female nuclear control room shift supervisor, Tracy Primo, talk about how a nuclear reactor works and about her journey starting out as a young Indigenous female nuclear operator in a male-dominated environment, being pregnant and working in a radiologically controlled area, and bringing up a family as a shift worker. We also had welders, mechanics, nuclear security officers, and other professionals, all women, mostly mothers, sharing their stories, explaining what it is that they do to assure safety and why they would encourage other women to join the industry. Ordinary people with good, well-paying jobs, working in an industry that cares about safety, the environment, and the communities in which it operates. In those sessions, two questions always came up: is it safe, and what about the waste? It's reassuring to me that used nuclear fuel is safely managed in interim storage until a permanent disposal facility is available. And I believe that there should be a permanent disposal facility. I live about 40 minutes away from the South Bruce site that's being considered. The world is facing unprecedented changes from the climate. These aren't just extreme weather, but also the social, political, and economic and environmental upheaval that will arise from climate disasters. We have the knowledge and the technology to lock away in a vault one of the world's hazardous materials, radioactive used fuel. I believe it's prudent to pursue that course of action and not to leave it to future generations, and to begin before we have to. I'm proud to be part of the nuclear industry, and if I had to make the choice again, I wouldn't need a coin flip. I would choose nuclear power with confidence. But my lived experience is different than yours. And if that coin toss had landed as tails and my career took a different path, I probably would have many of the same questions and feelings and concerns that you're grappling with. I hope that some of what I've shared and the dialogue we'll have this evening will be helpful to you as you think about what role nuclear power should play here in Treaty 3 territory, especially the Deep Geological Repository, but perhaps also the prospect of nuclear generating facilities in any of your future energy independence needs. Thank you so much for listening.
Miigwech Susan Brissett. That took a lot of guts for her to be first, and I really appreciate that. Our next speaker is Gordon.
Thank you.
Dr. Gordon Edwards.
Gordon Edwards, that's right.
Did you want to hand out any of your
I just want to
materials?
call attention to everybody that there's some handouts that I brought. One is a nuclear map of Canada to help to make the invisible visible. And it's accompanied by a glossary of icons explaining the images that are on the map. So take one of each. And if you want, you can put them on the wall and look at them for a period of time and then take them down when they're no longer useful. I have a couple of other handouts as well. One of them is a powerful statement by the Iroquois Caucus and the Anishinaabe Nation, which formed an alliance on the radioactive waste question. And they produced this joint declaration from 2020. And I recommend that you pick up a copy of that and read it. It's very interesting. And myself, I brought a sheet of resources, videos and documents that you can access. I've got the material there that you can look at those. So thank you very much, Miigwech. I feel very honored to be invited to here, and thank you, Grand Chief Kavanaugh. Thank you, the entire audience, for coming out tonight. I want to try and clarify some questions from an outsider's point of view. Obviously, I'm not a member of Treaty 3, but I have some experience with this radioactive waste question. Years ago, they wanted to do some test drilling up around 1978, 77, 78. They wanted to do test drilling in northwestern Ontario, and nobody wanted to allow them to do it because they were afraid that if they did the test drilling, they might end up getting the waste as well. And so after several failed attempts in northern Ontario, they went across the border into Manitoba and built an underground shaft 500 meters deep to do some research on the idea, which at that time was just an idea, of being able to bury this waste underground and therefore make it safe for future generations. And And that was followed by a 10-year environmental assessment. But here's the interesting fact, is that the Manitoba government actually passed a law forbidding the burial of radioactive waste in Manitoba. And that's why they were never involved in the NWMO process, because they were not candidate communities. It's outlawed. There's another situation that I was directly involved in, involving the government of Canada. The United States government wanted to build a geological repository for high-level radioactive waste, just like the one that's being proposed by NWMO for Ignace. They wanted to build it in Vermont. Now, Vermont is not Canada, but the government of Canada sent a note by the ambassador to the United States, sent a note to the White House. This is under Prime Minister Mulroney, saying that Canada would not look kindly on a radioactive waste repository on the border of Canada where the water is flowing into Canada. So the point I want to make here is that two governments, the Manitoba government and the Canadian government, both regarded this not just as a local issue, but as a regional issue. This is an issue that affects far more than just the municipality where it's located and the municipalities which are close geographically to the location of the waste dump. And I want to explain why that is. In Quebec, we don't have a law against burial, but we have a unanimous resolution from the National Assembly, which is the Parliament of Quebec. Unanimous. They hardly are ever unanimous about anything, but they have a unanimous resolution, again, saying that we will not accept radioactive waste from other jurisdictions to be buried in Quebec. So there are several examples already where high-powered decision makers have recognized that this is a regional issue and not just a local issue. It's something that Treaty 3 might want to consider for going forward. Now, why is this a regional issue instead of just a local issue? I'm sure that you have all heard, if you've listened to the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, that although these bundles are extremely dangerous when you're close to them, once you get further away from them, they become less and less dangerous. So in that case, you would say, well, why don't we just stay away from them? I mean, why do we bury them? Why do we spend $26 billion burying them? Why is NWMO willing to spend endless amounts of millions of dollars to make communities more amenable to listening and learning about the radioactive waste question? I would like to explain why. The reason why is this. If you look at this picture of a fuel bundle on the screen, before it goes into the nuclear reactor, it's safe to handle. You could handle this. You could be in the same room with it. You could hold it, you cradle it in your lap if you wanted to. But after it comes out, it would kill any human being in less than 20 seconds standing 1 meter away from it. Now, and yet it looks exactly the same. It looks just as solid. It looks just as tiny. It looks just as sweet as it did when it went in. Why the radical change? Why is it so much more dangerous when it comes out than when it went in? And the answer is, these are not the wastes. These are the containers of the waste. The waste is inside those fuel bundles. And there are hundreds, literally hundreds of newly created radioactive toxic materials which are created inside the reactor that were never there before. And that's what they want to get rid of. That's what they want to take away, because when the fuel bundle is damaged, those things escape. Now, here's what people are really concerned about. They're concerned not so much about the fuel bundles themselves, although they have to be handled very carefully, and they can only be handled by robotic equipment. Even after 30 years, I did a calculation the other day, and according to the NWMO own figures, if one were to hold one of those 30-year-old fuel bundles for more than a minute and a half, you would almost certainly die of radiation poisoning within a short period of time. Although you might survive, but you would be very, very sick. Just a minute and a half of contact. That's because the contact dose is so high. Now, what the people are really concerned about, however, is not staying away from the fuel. Well, that's fairly easy to do. The problem is if the contents leak and get into the ecosystem, then they get into the food chain, they get into the water, they get into the air, and they're there for a long time. And so it affects not only you, but your children, your grandchildren, and it affects the animals and other creatures who are affected. Nobody wants that to happen. whatever side of the debate you're on, nobody wants that to happen. Certainly NWMO does not want that to happen. They're hoping that by being very careful and putting it way down deep, that it will never get out. But hope is not enough. Hope is not enough, because you have to be sure. And don't forget that even though the people in the industry, I agree, are very professional and they are very concerned about safety and so on, you know what? When they abandon this waste, which is their intention is to abandon it, when they abandon this waste, there's nobody there. There's nobody looking after it. There's nobody there to monitor it. There's nobody there to retrieve it, to repackage it, to stop the escape of these radioactive materials. If they start leaking into the environment, chances are they'll simply continue leaking into the environment forever. And the result is that we'll have contamination at the surface that was unanticipated and will be harmful to certain people and certain creatures. So that's what they're trying to avoid. This is what we all want to avoid this. Now, sometimes the fuel is so damaged that it's actually the bundles are destroyed. And this is done deliberately by the United States and by other nuclear weapons countries because they want to get out a material that's in the spent fuel bundles, the used fuel bundles, called plutonium. And plutonium was used in nuclear weapons. It was used to build hundreds, tens of thousands of nuclear weapons in the United States. It's a nuclear explosive material. But the trouble is, to get the plutonium out, you have to destroy the fuel bundle. And when you destroy the fuel bundle, you release all those hundreds of radioactive materials. And those hundreds of radioactive materials are now stored in liquid tanks, some of which are leaking and which are tremendously expensive to try and look after. The report from the U.S. General Accounting Office is they expect that the cleanup of the Hanford facility where these tanks are located will cost between, get a load of this is a 2023 estimate, $300 billion or $640 billion. That's the U.S. General Accounting Office, which are responsible for looking after government expenditures. That's because those materials were allowed to escape out of the bundles, which we don't want to do. However, there are some people in the nuclear industry who would like to get that plutonium out for peaceful purposes, to use it as a nuclear fuel. The problem is you can't get the plutonium out without destroying the fuel bundles and releasing all those other materials. So that's a problem. Now, when those radioactive materials get out, they have different pathways. They're all different chemical things. And the only thing that makes them different from normal chemicals, normal food, is that the atoms are unstable. And that means the atoms are like little time bombs. They explode. And when they explode, they damage the living cells in your body, and they go to different parts of the body depending upon the chemistry, depending upon what kind of materials they are. The iodine, radioactive iodine, goes to the thyroid gland. And there were 5,000 children who had to have the thyroid glands surgically removed after the Chernobyl accident. That was in Belarus. So they don't want this stuff to escape. Down south, all the people around the nuclear reactors are given iodine pills, non-radioactive iodine pills, because if there's an accident and the radioactive iodine escapes, if you take these pills, it might prevent the radioactive iodine from getting into your thyroid gland, and therefore might prevent some of those problems. Well, that's the problem with letting these things escape. And that's the concern that people have. And it's that escaping of the materials that makes it a regional problem and not just a local problem. Now, what we've learned from science is that the targets of low-level radiation exposures, when I say low-level radiation exposure, nobody is going to keel over dead from getting a little bit of this radioactive material in their food. They won't even notice. Most of it will be relatively innocuous. But what we found through science is that when there's low dose exposure chronically over a period of time, that it's really the population that suffers. A small fraction of the population will develop cancer. And years later, it takes years for the cancer to develop. But if a larger population is exposed to the same level of contamination, we say that the population dose is greater. And in that case, you get more cancers. So that the larger the population that's exposed, the more cancers you see. And also, of course, the more radioactive material that leaks, the more cancers you see. The idea, of course, is to prevent any leakage, to keep that leakage to zero, and therefore there's no consequences. Well, that's nice, that's the hope, but hope is not enough. Hope is not enough. You need to have more than just hope. And my organization, the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, recognizes that there's a sincerity behind the people who want to bury the waste. They want to protect future generations, but we think that they should not be continuing to produce the waste, because as long as they continue to produce the waste, there'll never be underground, all of it. All of it, some of it will always be above ground. And therefore, we're not really making the above ground part that much safer. In fact, the Ontario Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning investigated this issue way back in the 1970s. They published a report in 1978 called A Race Against Time. And they said, just for the sake of argument, what would happen if you took one CANDU reactor, just one, and took 1 year's worth of fuel that they use, just 1 year's worth? How much water would you need if all that stuff, all the ingredients were to escape? How much water would you need to dilute it down to the level that is the maximum permissible contamination under law? And the answer is, for one reactor, 1 year, approximately the volume of Lake Superior. And we have now 18 reactors operating, don't we, in Ontario? So that's 18 Lake Superiors every year. That means that the waste that's being produced every year, if those things were to escape, that's a big, big if, because it isn't going to happen. Not all of that material is ever going to disappear. But let's see what happens if only one fuel bundle, if all the contents of just one fuel bundle were to escape. Well, they had an experience at Bruce Power, in fact. They had a fuel bundle that was accidentally crushed by the fueling machine. And because it was crushed, all of the materials in that fueling machine escaped and went through the water and through the pipes and accumulated in the pipes. Years later, when they were sending workers in to refurbish that nuclear reactor, for almost 3 weeks, the workers were breathing radioactive dust that was in the pipe because of that crushed fuel bundle, and people had either forgotten or refused to take into account the fact that that accident had happened years earlier, and the consequences were now being felt by these workers. So even one fuel bundle, 500 workers were exposed unnecessarily over a period of almost 3 weeks. So even though you're careful, accidents happen. And what I would like to say is, I hope it doesn't happen in Treaty 3, who has received really no benefits from nuclear power at all. And the only benefits they're offering is look after the waste. You look after the waste, you'll get some money, we'll give you money, and we'll give you jobs, but you're basically a nuclear garbage dump. So I think that that's something one has to take into account. And I don't minimize the importance of money, the importance of jobs. God knows there's many communities that certainly need a lot of both, but one has to weigh the total issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon. All right, I just want you to keep an eye on the timer here, folks. And I'd like to invite Joe Hale up, please, from the NWMO, as well as Mark Gobian. Are you coming up? Mark? You come up when you, all right.
I can just use that too.
Yep, the arrow.
Oh, wait there. Evening, everyone. Just want to thank Mona Gardner and Chief Kavanaugh for the opening remarks, and to acknowledge that we're here in the territory of Treaty 3. And I just wanted to thank Susan and Gordon. Good presentations. My name is Joe Heil. I work for the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. My title is Director of Indigenous Engagements for the Northwest. I've worked in the energy sector now for this year will be 42 years. I started my career out as a nuclear operator. I worked at the Pickering Nuclear Power Station and then later at the Darlington Nuclear Power Station as an operator. And some of the pictures that I'm going to show you are something that could be me in those pictures. Believe it, I was a bit thinner then, and it could be me. So I've worked in the industry. 100% agree with respect to Susan's message of safety. Certainly, we are all about safety. And, you know, if we do come to end up coming to the Northwest, no, There, I got some extra time. If we do end up going to Northwest, I think we will be the model of safety for Northwestern Ontario. We do have a phenomenal safety culture. My presentation is really about giving sort of an overview of what we're proposing as a project. So I'm going to go through this fairly quick. We only have 10 minutes. Susan touched on this and also on Gordon. Really, it was, we have had a nuclear industry since the late 1940s and commercially since 1962. With Ralston and Douglas Point. And we've been producing nuclear waste for 62 years. We've been trying to deal with the issue of doing that. And one of the attempts was, a result was the Seaborne Commission, again, looking at this issue. And the results of that were that from a technical point of view, that what we were proposing, a deep geological repository for that project, was technically feasible and probably would work. But it wasn't publicly acceptable. We couldn't demonstrate social safety. So they said, go back to the drawing board and put a program together that would actually, be seen as social safety would be shown. And the Nuclear Waste Management Organization was formed from that. There was something called the Used Fuel Waste Act, and out of that, our organization was formed back in 2003. Our thoughts about what social safety is really was a concept called informed willing host. And so in 2010, we asked people, to volunteer to actually look at this. And one of the people that volunteered was the town of Ignis. We actually had 22 communities. Actually, we had a First Nation community, English River First Nation, Saskatchewan, put their hand up to look at this. And what we've been doing over the last 14 years is actually narrowing down based on two things. One, really the technical, the geology of the rock, and then these 22 communities, and sort of the social acceptability of the community to actually move forward with the project. I think Gordon talked about this. I think the key with respect to nuclear waste, when we talk about it, it is a solid. It's a ceramic. It's very hard, very heavy, and it's ceramic. So, it's not a liquid. It doesn't leak. What happens, it has to dissolve to actually then get into the environment thereafter. Currently, all the fuel that is radioactive is either inside a reactor or in these swimming pools at the nuclear sites or in large containers. Again, these are temporary solutions. But the good news is we know they're all there and they're all being stored safely. Our project is to take something and actually store it safely for a very long period of time, because it does have to be stored for a long time. We don't disagree. This stuff is dangerous. This stuff will get out if we do not do something and have a permanent solution to it. So, I don't disagree that something needs to be done. I think we both agree that it needs to be done. Similar, if we just leave it in containers, those containers are pretty strong. They're licensed for 50 years and they probably could last another 50 years, but eventually you have to repackage them. Eventually you have to maintain them. And how long are we going to do that? After speaking to Canadians, including Indigenous people, the idea was to do something now. And this is sort of the reason why I do what I do, is that I benefited from the nuclear industry. I actually had a job in the nuclear industry, but also I recognize that I should be dealing with it. I mean, we're the ones that benefit. I'm the one that benefited from it, and we actually need to solve that and not push it on to future generations. A deep geological repository, is not a dump. It's not a landfill. It's actually more akin to a vault. We're looking to put this deep into the earth, below the water table, disconnected from the surface, and store it there indefinitely. So it is meant to be stored there indefinitely. And it is more than just storing it in the rock. It's a multi-barrier system. We have the ceramic itself, which is a hard material. It doesn't dissolve. We have the fuel sheath around it. We're actually going to encase that into a container that's then lined with copper, and then we're going to line that with clay. and then, up to 750 meters, 800 meters of rock. I have a video. I know there'll be lots of questions with respect to transportation. I think this video will help sort of show some of the things I just talked about. So let me just hit the play button here, and hopefully, cross my fingers, this works.
Transportation packages, demonstration trials. Canada's plan calls for the safe long-term management of used nuclear fuel by centrally containing and isolating it in a deep geological repository. As part of the plan, used nuclear fuel must be transported from interim storage facilities to the repository site. Transportation is expected to begin in the 2040s. Over the years and around the world, transportation packages have been subjected to a number of demonstration trials. These trials are intended to instill confidence in the public that used nuclear fuel can be transported safely. Canada is among many countries to adhere to international standards and to test the safety of these transportation packages. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization will follow and build upon a long global history of safely transporting used nuclear fuel. For over 50 years, more than 20,000 used nuclear fuel shipments have been made worldwide without any serious injuries, health impacts, or environmental consequences. For example, a test in 1984 by the UK Central Electricity Generating Board showed that a package designed to meet international standards could withstand being rammed by a locomotive traveling at 160 kilometers per hour. The package remained intact with only superficial scarring. In 1999, the German Federal Institute for Materials Research and Testing exploded a rail tank car filled with propane next to a transportation package for used nuclear fuel. What happened? The exploding rail car directly hit and flipped the package. The package lodged itself into the ground about 10 meters away. While the rail car was destroyed, the transportation package stayed intact, preventing the release of any of its contents. These extreme demonstration trials show the safety and strength of transportation packages designed to move used nuclear fuel safely without releasing contents, even under the most severe conditions. Safety is at the core of Canada's plan. Working with regulatory bodies and under international requirements will ensure the protection of people and the environment as used nuclear fuel is transported to the eventual repository site. Dig deeper, learn more by visiting nwmo.ca.
So I think I just want to reinforce that. I mean, the program assumes there's going to be an incident, or people like to call accidents. So we are going to have second to none when it comes to a safety program with respect to transportation, and certainly we transportate. The industry already transports significant amounts of radioactive material already. But that's not good enough. We also have to design the package so that if there is an accident, that it'll survive that accident. And that's the philosophy. So it's even that much more layers. And even if in the extreme case in which there is an accident and the material is released, it is a solid. I used to be on a team called the Transportation Emergency Response Team. It was one of my roles and activities to actually go out if there were an accident and actually deal with issues like that. God forbid that ever happened. It never did happen in that time, but we were trained to go out there and certainly, with the proper shielding and equipment, basically it gets put back into the containers. And a simple job of just literally just picking up and putting in a container and monitoring, see if there's anything left and putting it back in. So it can be dealt with. Is not something that spreads into the environment like a liquid.
Transportation.
Okay. Just quickly, where we're looking right now, the town of Ignis put their hand up. About Wabigoon at the time is the closest community. They did not put their hand up. They ejected against the project after many years of discussion. They decided to move forward after we signed a protocol agreement with them. Basically, we need their agreement to move forward. They essentially have a veto on this project moving forward. The picture you see here is really the rock that we're looking at. This rock is actually between the town of Ignis and Wabigoon. To give you, it's a big giant piece of rock called a batholith. It's about 10 kilometers wide by 40 kilometers long and 2 or 3 kilometers thick. It is a very large rock, and this is the area in which we're looking to bury this and put the waste. And this is just a blow up of the same. Right now, I know I don't have much time left here. Site selection. We're in a site selection phase. So right now, yes, we're dealing largely with Ignis and Wabigoon. The idea is that we'll make a site selection hopefully this year, and then we move into a regulatory decision-making phase that'll last up to 10 years. And during that phase, certainly we'll be engaged with all the surrounding communities. We already are engaged with a number of the surrounding communities, but certainly, you know, your voice will be heard, you know, whether it's on transportation or certain Gordon Edwards certainly will be presenting at those hearings and what have you. And then we'll be looking to get a license to prepare site, a license to construct. If we do get our license to construct, it will be hopefully around 2033. It'll take 10 years to construct. Then we're looking at operations to move all the fuel to the site and put it into the repository. Take about 50 years. That takes you to about 2090. And then there will be about a 100-year monitoring and decommissioning period thereafter. And it only happened with the agreement of the communities at that period of time to actually then seal it up and put it into its final state. This you may be familiar with. This is off of your website. This is a map of your traditional territory, Treaty 3. I put a little blue spot over exactly where the proposed site is presently. The communities in which we have engaged with or have engaged with in the past certainly is Wabigoon. We did have a short engagement with Eagle, but we also engage currently with Lac-Seul, Ojibwe Nation of Saugeen, Lac de Mille-Lacs, Seine River, Nikagusu-Missaconning, Whitefish Bay, Wabasgang, and certainly Grand Council Treaty 3 and the Dryden Native Friendship Center. So these engagements are really about learning, and this is really what today is about. It's really about learning about our project to really show what we're proposing as we move forward. So I think I'll leave it at that because I think we have a lot of opportunities for questions. I just wanted to set the stage for what this project is really about. So thank you very much.
So, hello, my name is Mark Gopian. I'm also from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. I'm one of these fabled technical folks that people like to refer to. I work for the Safety Assessment Department, and really my role within the NWMO is to ensure that this project will be safe. To Gordon's point, hope really isn't enough. We need to be rigorous in the science that we do, characterizing the site, understanding the sites, understanding the science, understanding what can happen, understanding what will happen, and understanding what won't happen. We'll have lots of time to discuss different aspects of the project. I'm here to help Joe answer some of the technical questions, but I thought you'd want to know maybe a little bit about me. I really liked Sarah's presentation, introducing herself, how she got into the industry. I thought I'd share something similar very briefly. I studied physics, mathematics, computer science. That was my academic background. I had opportunity when I was in university to work with a nuclear reactor at the Royal Military College in Kingston. I found the technology fascinating. I was really enthralled with the idea of splitting the atom, that humans had the capacity to exact such control and such just the wonder that can be accomplished through science. And similar to Sarah, one of the first questions that I stumbled across and asked was, what about the waste? Power generation is fascinating, and the waste has always been an issue and hasn't really had a long-term solution. From my perspective, with my background, I definitely could have made more money going into finance or something else, But I chose to work in this industry because I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to ensure it was safe, and I wanted to deal with a meaningful issue. You know, I'm younger, much younger than many of the other panelists here. You know, I'm almost 40. I've got a young son who's, you know, almost 2, and I wanted to spend my career on a project that I felt was meaningful. And the nuclear waste issue is an issue. It needs to be dealt with. And it's something that I wanted to help deal with and to ensure that it's dealt with safely. And that's why I'm involved in this project and why I work for safety assessment, because this is an important issue. It is a hazardous material. It needs to be dealt with safely. And I believe that we can do that. I also believe this isn't something that we should push down the road to future generations. I don't want my son to have to deal with this. It's something I think we can deal with now. We have the technology, we have the money, we have the ability to do this. And so really that's where I'm coming at with this from. I'm happy to talk any of the technical aspects of this project. I'm really happy to share my experiences within the industry, working with all different countries on this sort of a project, working with different people in the industry. It's incredibly collaborative. It's incredibly fascinating, and really safety is at the forefront of anything nuclear related. And so I'm really happy you're all here today to learn more about this project. One of the best things that you can do is learn. And that's why we're all here today. And I'm here to learn from you, and hopefully you're here to learn from us as well. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Mark and Joe. Up next, we have Brene Lloyd.
So, good evening. Ani, bonjour. My name is Brene Lloyd, and I come from Robinson-Huron Treaty area. So, quite a long way. I come through Robinson-Huron, the Anishinaabe-Oski Nation territory, then a little zip across Robinson-Superior to come to Treaty 3. And I've been coming to Treaty 3 since 2010, when the NWMO first was invited into Treaty 3 territory by IGNAE. So I'm really grateful to be here. Really thank you for the invitation, and really appreciate your time coming out this evening. Respectfully, I want to say that I've been asked by some Treaty 3 members to really establish that this is a conversation, that it's information sharing, and that it's not a consultation. And I was asked to do that, and I'm pleased to do that. That is my understanding with the, with the organizers of the meeting as well. But that concern has been expressed to me, and, related to that, a concern about having to register. So I'm really grateful that the session is being recorded, and it's going to be available to everyone as we continue to share this information and be in this conversation. So I'm just going to launch in. The nuclear industry has been pursuing this idea for 50 years. NWMO has been the proponent for over 20 years. IGNIS invited NWMO into the territory 14 years ago. And now this is the year that NWMO says they're going to decide. So I've got 5 slides and just 10 minutes, and I'm going to just jump in. So hang on to your hats. I'm going to talk about the different sets of activities in the NWMO project, the different steps or phases. This is the way I think through the project and what's going to happen and what are some of the things that we need to be concerned about at every stage. So the first step happens at the reactor station at Bruce, Pickering, Darlington, also in La Pro, in New Brunswick, and Gentil, where the reactor shut down in Quebec. 90% of the waste comes from Ontario, from Southern Ontario, from Ontario Power Generation's operations. Ontario Power Generation has majority control of the board of NWMO, provides over 90% of the funding. So the activity, the project starts at the reactor station when the waste is created. And Gordon has already talked about this. And I'm going to look for the arrows. No, wrong arrow. There. So Gordon's already talked about this. It begins with uranium, and the NWMO likes to carry around this uranium bundle, and you can pick it up at their display tables as if, as if it's a relatively normal object. It's not a normal object. When that uranium goes into the reactor station, it's in there for 18 months, and it goes in as uranium, but it comes out as something completely different. Hundreds of different radioactive ingredients or elements in that waste. And these are ingredients or elements that don't exist in nature. And they will be dangerous and must be kept contained, isolated, separate from us into eternity. Think about how long it's been, how long does a century last in our memory? It's difficult to think back to the time, think back to the time of the signing of the treaties. Think back to the time of when the pyramids were built. That's 5,000 years. That's a blink of the eye in the life of this radioactive waste. It's difficult to think about the time, but these wastes must be kept separate from the environment for millions of years. So it's not uranium, it's high-level radioactive waste. And it comes out of the reactor, it goes into dry storage containers at the reactor station. First, it goes into a pool. It comes out of the reactor into a pool of water, the irradiated fuel bay, and it goes in there because it's too hot to manage in any other way. And that pool, irradiated fuel bay, it cools it and it provides a shielding, a separation. And then after 10 years, it goes into the dry storage containers, and it's there for estimated about 30 years. Then the next thing that happens at the reactor in the NWMO project, the waste has been created, but the first step for this project, for moving it off the site, for moving it a long distance away from the site, the first step is to extract it from those dry storage containers. And the NWMO doesn't talk about this at all. Really important part of this project. The transfer of the waste, the handling of the waste is a very challenging, technically challenging, and potentially the parts of the project where we are most likely to see the environment contaminated and workers contaminated. And what the NWMO says about it is that the waste owner is responsible for that. They're responsible for getting it out of storage into the transportation container. But they don't talk about how it's going to be transferred. Maybe that's more a concern for the reactor communities, and it's not clear to me why the reactor communities aren't asking those questions, but I'm not hearing them there. The other question is why? Why is the NWMO choosing a set of activities that requires them to move the waste from the dry storage container into a transportation container, and then later, a few steps down the road in my slideshow, later they're going to have to transfer it again in the used fuel packaging plant? In early versions of this, and this version of the plan, the NWMO's plan, it's a set of ideas. It's a set of concepts. There's a concept report. The transportation packages, one of them is a concept. The used fuel packaging plant is a concept. These are concepts. In earlier versions of these concepts by other proponents, it was put forward equally. The waste could be moved into a transportation container, or it could be moved into the final container at the reactor station. And I have not heard a rationale for NWMO as to why they have opted for the more dangerous and the more challenging of those two options, which is to transfer it into a transportation container, then again later into the final container. So there's a big question. Why are they going that route? Why have they chosen a path that means they're going to be constructing a used fuel packaging plant in Treaty 3 territory with all of the risks associated with that? But I'm going to get to that in a minute. Transportation. So the transferring of the waste from the reactor station to the centralized location. And tonight we're talking about the Revel site in the heart of Treaty 3 as that centralized location. So the NWMO talks about their transportation containers. The used fuel transportation package is the one they point to the most. But they've also got the concept of a basket transportation package, which they say will be used for the waste from the non-OPG stations. So Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, the Gentil, the New Quebec, New Brunswick sites. It's a concept. That's all we've, very minimal description of it. And then there's the dry storage container transportation package, which is those big shiny packages you see in all the photos. They're now counting that as a potential transportation package, a 100-ton container designed for moving short distances on the site for on-site storage. That's now one of their transportation containers. But they mostly talk about the used fuel transportation package, and they talk about it as a certified package. It's gone through the test. Usually they talk about it's a certified package. It is a certified package. It was certified by Ontario Hydro in the 1980s to support the previous company, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, when they were trying to get a concept approved. And Joe referred to it and said it was deemed to be technically feasible. Well, the language was on balance at a conceptual stage of development, technically feasible. I call it the faint praise approval. There's more qualifiers in it than just saying it's technically feasible. The panel was asked, has ACL demonstrated their concept to be safe and acceptable? And Joe's right. On the acceptable side, they said flat out no. On the safety side, they say from a social perspective, no. From a technical side, on balance, conceptual stage, technically feasible. To me, that's a maybe. NWMO talks about the tests, and you saw a couple of videos of, a different container in a different country being struck by a moving object. NWMO usually talks about the certified package, and then they talk about the tests, the international standards they must meet, the drop test, the puncture test, the thermal test, which is a test in fire, and the water test. I have a colleague who's very critical of these tests because she just doesn't think they're tough enough. But I think the bigger problem is that the NWMO package hasn't been subject to these tests. Yes, they're the international tests. We did an access to information request. It took 2 years to get the answer. And the answer was that the used fuel transportation package went through a limited set of tests in the 1980s, partially completed, partially successful, of a half-scale model, not the full-scale model, not the not the one that you see the images of. That was for the drop test and the puncture test. And we learned that for the fire test, how long can the package sustain being in fire? A fire like you might see in, like we've seen in other instances, it could be a long-lasting fire. It doesn't have to go through that test. It can be substituted with computer calculations and estimates. The same for the water immersion test. So to me, it's a lesson of we have to listen very carefully and with some skepticism when we're told the good news stories about how safe, and this is demonstrated. We have to look at these very carefully. The transportation, these packages are going to be transported very long distances. The average distance is about 1,650 kilometers from the Southern Ontario reactors to the Revel site in the heart of Treaty 3 territory. And it's going to go through many communities. Many of the communities in Treaty 3 are downstream. So your concerns are going to be about the longer term, about the releases to the downstream communities. Many Treaty 3 communities are along the transportation route, and your concern might be more about the risk of transportation accident, but not just accident. There's also risks just in what they call normal conditions, normal operating conditions. There are low levels of radiation released from the packages. They're shielded. That means they're trying to create a barrier from the radioactivity, the gamma radiation being released. But the shielding isn't 100%. So there's still low levels of exposure. There's low levels of radiation coming off those trucks. And NWMO about a decade ago did a report where they put out their calculations that they thought or argued demonstrated that it would be the exposures would be at an acceptable level. And they were based on a whole number of assumptions. But two things. One is if the assumptions change, for example, so exposure is a mix, it's a combination of dose, distance, and duration. Dose, how much radiation's coming off. Distance, how far away are you from it? Duration, how long are you in the area of that that source of radioactive exposure? So the calculations say, great, acceptable level. Although science has said that there is no level of exposure that doesn't have an associated risk. But we all know, traveling on northern roads, things don't always go as normal. There's construction, there's accidents, there's road closures. And so if our time beside or behind or in front of that truck is longer, those calculations from a decade ago don't have the strength that they need in terms of giving us a message that it's actually safe. So then processing, then we get to the used fuel packaging plant. At this stage, the waste has arrived at the site, and that's when the most immediate exposures will occur. In transportation, there's going to be low levels and there's a risk of much higher levels of exposure. If there was an accident and the container was breached, then we would see much higher levels. But when we get to the used fuel packaging plant, we know then there are going to be exposures. There are going to be releases of radioactivity. There's going to be low level and intermediate level waste, additional waste generated. Some of those will be liquid waste. And that all happens in the used fuel packaging plant. And that's the second time the waste is opened up, is exposed. So now the transportation containers arrive and those containers are opened up and the fuel will be transferred. The high level waste will be transferred from the transportation containers into the final container. And that's going to be done in something called a hot cell. So it's a room that's constructed with concrete walls and lead and glass windows, and everything's going to be done robotically. And there's a number of things that need to be done in those rooms. The fuel has to be extracted. It has to be put into the containers. The containers have to be put together. There has to be a weld, and then there has to be a final coating. The coating on these containers are very, very thin. But that final coating around the weld will be applied in that hot cell. And that'll all be done robotically because no human can go in those rooms. And it will be all observed through cameras because no human can go in those rooms. So our safety depends on all that machinery working really, really, really well. And those other machines being able to observe and really determine that it's, that everything is going that well. So this is all described in the concept report from 2021. We didn't hear much about the used fuel packaging plant until about 2020, 2021. There's 2 paragraphs in the summary, and there's 11 pages with lots of graphics in the body of the report. And that's what we know. This is an absolutely important and high-risk part of the operation. Technically challenging, never been done any operation of this type, of this scale in Canada, and we've got 11 pages and 2 paragraphs. And this is a certainty of radioactive releases. Then we move underground. So then finally, we get to the Deep Geological Repository, which is where the NWMO has placed most of its emphasis. So this is when they transfer and place these wastes in underground chambers or vaults. The diagrams have changed over the years, and we don't have time to talk about some of the reasons why it's been assessed that NWMO changed their fundamental designs for the underground layout. Fundamental changes in 2016. If you ask me, I'd like to talk about it. So then they transfer and place these wastes underground, and then they have something they call a multi-barrier concept. So they've got, the fuel and then the container, and I see I'm out of time. The fuel and then the containers and then the bentonite. Each of these are subject to failure. Singly, collectively, they're subject to failure. And when they fail, there will be releases. And those releases will go out through the groundwater to the surface water, lots of different avenues. The final stage is an abandonment. That's the final licensing stage. That's the project end. That's when the license is, the final license is issued. The proponent, the operator can walk away, and those wastes will be abandoned in the heart of Treaty 3 territory. In the heart of Turtle Island, those wastes will be there. At the height of land for the Turtle River, Rainy Lake water system, and the Wabigoon River system. So throughout Treaty 3 territory, you're downstream, and the water, the groundwater is connected to the surface water. And we're not saying it's going to be a big rush. It's going to be within a decade or a century. It's over time. And the industry doesn't argue against that. They don't argue that there will be no releases over time. The debate is, in the last hearing in the 1980s, the debate became quite clearly how much, how soon, what effect. It's not a debate about whether the containers will fail and whether there will be releases. It's how much, how soon, how will that affect us? Making the waste more secure in its current location is the best safety option. We've got a set of concepts. There's some ideas. Let industry develop them. As long as they continue to generate the waste, there's going to be the hottest, most radioactive waste is going to continue at the reactor site. I've looked at, this is the 4th deep geological repository we've looked at in detail. There's not been a successful one yet. Let's say, okay, industry, take 40 or 50 years, see if you can develop the science, see if you can make the case. But in the meantime, don't be pushing communities to accept a package deal when the package deal isn't yet soundly described, determined, or available for scrutiny. So thank you so much for your time. I hope I didn't go too long.
I'm not sure how long she went, but I'm going to tell you, if you don't like to be at a mic, 10 minutes is a long time. But when you got a lot to say, it's not enough time. They were all wanting a lot more time, but we've got one more speaker. And when that speaker is finished, Peter, we're going to have a break. We'll come back and we'll engage in some of the questions that you presented, as well as some of the questions that have come from other members in this territory prior to this session, okay?
Oh, I'd love to. And one of the things that happens, of course, at the place I worked at, the Ontario Cancer Institute, is that we kill things with radiation, tumor cells. And yet you might say it's such a dangerous thing, but the doctors around don't die because we know how to protect ourselves. And part of the process that you're going through here is also to look at protection. Let's see. I'll give you the summary because I don't know how long I'll take, but this is important. So far, we've created about 63,000 tons of used CANDU fuel. And that fuel, in the meantime, has created $440 billion of non-carbon energy, electricity. Yet 99% of the CANDU fuel is still unused. So I would say that's not waste if we can use it. We certainly can, because we can get 130 times more energy by recycling this fuel through something called fast spectrum. Small modular reactors are nowadays. The very first reactor that ever produced electricity was one of these types of reactors in 1951. So it's not a brand new technology. It's something that we're looking at again And in the process, we can eliminate the long-term radiotoxicity. And of course, because we create more electricity, we have lots of energy, we have prosperity, and those jobs working in the industry are highly skilled jobs. And because we have so much fuel in this unused fuel, it will be for centuries. So I think we should go in that direction. What we're concerned with here is something that's in between Dryden and Ignace, right there, where the Nuclear Waste Management Organization has drilled boreholes to build a deep geological repository to get rid of the used fuel. You've seen pictures of the repository. Once that's built, then, as was described, we're going to take the fuel bundles out of the dry storage in Pickering and Bruce and put it into transport casks, and the transport casks then will be transported to a deep geological repository, and the material is then going to be put into, as planned, copper containers and put down there. And the question that we have, of course, is it safe forever? Well, I wondered whether there's even a safer place about 20 years ago. And I was looking at subducting ocean plates, where the ocean floor would then take the material and put it underneath the North American continent, and it will be gone for millions of years before it even hits the rim of volcanoes where anything might come up in the process. But as I looked at this material, I thought that a better approach really is to recycle and eliminate the material altogether. So the why and how is something that I want to touch on here. We talk about these fuel bundles. They contain 100% uranium. They go into the nuclear reactor, the CANDU reactor in our case, and it produces energy. And up to now, since 1971, it's produced $440 billion worth of electricity at 10 cents per kilowatt hour, which is a tremendous amount. But if I divide that by the population of Ontario, that's about $30,000 per Ontario man, woman, or child. It gives you an idea of how much that is. And yet, the used fuel that comes out of this reactor has only been used to 0.75% of the mined uranium that went into it. That's less than 1%. Or if you look at it differently, more than 99% is still unused fuel. Most of that is just plain uranium, which we're not really worried about. What we're worried about is this long-term radioactive material called transuranics, because the uranium captures neutrons and doesn't split and creates neptunium, plutonium, americium, curium, and so forth, atoms that are bigger than uranium. And that's the long-lasting material that we're worried about. There's also split atoms called the fission products, which are the split uranium atoms or split plutonium atoms. They are relatively radioactive for only a short time. By short, basically virtually all of this material is gone in about 7 generations. In 267 years, it's back down to normal background. There are some which last 17 million years. But because the radiation takes so long to decay, there's actually very little that's in the environment. We actually live in a sea of radiation from uranium, which has been around since the Earth was born 4.5 billion years ago. And it's still there, but it's radioactive. So the question, of course, is, can one recycle this material? And what does that mean? Basically, one takes the used fuel, does this dangerous maneuver of opening up the material and separating out the fission products, because all of the heavy atoms can be cycled back into the reactor and reused in these not CANDU reactors, because the CANDU reactor uses very little of the fuel, but in these old style or new style reactors called fast spectrum reactors. They can take the material once the fission products have been separated out and recycle it. Let me do that again, because that probably was too quick. The fission products are separated, and all the heavy atoms, the ones that last this long time and worry you, are put back in and reused again and again and again. And that gives you about 99% of a yield of that material. That's a tremendous amount of energy. How much energy? Well, it's $4.2 million per Ontarian, or a total of $60 trillion. And we want to, at the moment, consider that to be waste and to be put into a deep geological repository. I think that's I would say, almost sinful with respect to future generations, because that is non-carbon energy. So why am I up here talking to you? Well, you need local power. You're building and upgrading your electrical lines. The one from Miigwech to Pickle Lake has been done and upgraded to a 230 kilovolt line by a consortium of First Nations. And the idea is to electrify 17 remote communities. I don't know whether I've got them all right here or not, but you might also consider going up to Miigwech in the Ring of Fire and supply energy there, which is all very nice, but those are just wires. You need energy to feed up those wires. And that energy can come from some of these small modular reactors of the fast spectrum variety. Those require starting fuel, enriched starting fuel, not just plain ordinary uranium like the CANDU reactor needs. And that enriched starting fuel at the moment is only available commercially from Russia. That's politically sensitive right now. And so if you look at this, this can be obtained from recycled, used CANDU fuel. There's enough starting fuel for these reactors for about 24,000 megawatts of total power in the used fuel that we've got right now. There are reactors that exist. There's one that's being looked at by New Brunswick Power, which is 100 megawatts. There's 340 to 500 megawatt reactor that's being built by Bill Gates in the state of Wyoming. And GE Hitachi has one available at 300 megawatts. GE Hitachi is providing OPG with a different type of reactor at the moment, but they also have this one available. Now, it doesn't take very much room to build those reactors. Pickering is about 1 kilometer square. And so they fit into a building like this. The recycling that is suggested for these reactors and is actually being worked out is not very voluminous either. It's not the huge complexes that you have in Britain and in Japan that require many buildings and use a different process. This is an electro-refiner, and this size refiner is enough for one of those 300 megawatt reactors. So you have several of them, and you obviously require preparation in that. All of that fits into a building about this size. So it's possible to do that. It's been done. The technology has been worked out, and like I said, the very first reactor that created electricity was one of these. And so if we take our 63,000 tons of CANDU fuel that we have at the moment, which has already created this many dollars worth of non-carbon electricity. We can convert that into $60 trillion worth. Of course, it'll be years before all of that is used up. But the long-term radioactive material can be extracted, say, from something the size of the Pickering nuclear used fuel in about 20 years. So that gets us 130 times more energy than we've already gotten out of the material by using recycling through fast spectrum reactors. And in the process, you eliminate the long-term radiotoxicity. And like I said, it gives you energy, prosperity, highly skilled jobs for centuries. And you can do it because there's an example of one of the indigenous people called Tracy Primo, who had a degree in the arts. She went into work for Bruce Power and became an operator of one of these CANDU reactors. So it's certainly possible. You don't have to be a specialist to start with. The companies teach you how to do this. So I would say, let's do this now. That's something else. A sugar cube of used CANDU fuel creates about $21,000 worth of electricity. That's how powerful that used fuel is. So consider the used fuel to be worth more than gold, really. But it takes courage, and it takes engineering, it takes physics to do this safely, but it can be done. As far as I know, in North America, ever since we started creating electricity from nuclear power, nobody has died from exposures to used nuclear fuel. Keep that in mind. We know it's dangerous, but we also are smart enough to prevent harm to us. And you say, well, but there will be accidents. Yes, there will be. Thank you very much.
Thank you for all of you and your courage to come up here and spend some time. Appreciate that. All right, we're going to get right into it. These are questions that have come from you and or fellow members of Treaty 3 territory. I'm going to wait for this screen. Hey, panelists, just so I can do a little Oprah here, I'm going to try and stay aligned with you so I can see you. And let's just start the very first question about why we're having this conversation in the first place. So let's get a broader scope of why we're having the conversation. Where is the waste coming from? Is the future of clean energy nuclear energy? And with the waste being stored in Treaty 3 territory, or it's proposed to be stored in Treaty 3 territories, will this site become a dumping ground? I'm going to put this question over to you, Joe, first, or Mark, and then if there is another panelist who would like to respond to that just give me the, okay? We've got about a half an hour, folks, and several questions, possibly 45 minutes. So
the question is, why? Like why? Well, we irrespective of the solution, whether it is, keep it where it is or reprocessing, we're going to have nuclear waste. We've been, like I said earlier, we've been producing nuclear waste since the late 1940s. It exists. We have temporary solutions and we need a permanent solution. The reason here in Treaty 3, there was actually a couple communities that put their hands up. I think it was Red Lake and Ignis in Treaty 3 that put their hands up.
Ear Falls.
Ear Falls. Was it Ear Falls? Okay, sorry. Thanks for the correction. So it was Ear Falls. when I think even now, when we're thinking about, how this process played out, I think even now we probably would redo it. And I think how we would redo it is really say, hey, look, we should really have done this, with a First Nation putting their hand up with a municipal partner. I think that's really what it was. And I remember, and I'll share this, and I hope it doesn't get back to Wabagoon, but I apologized on behalf of the corporation for that, for saying, hey, look, we don't think we did this right, but, are you still willing to move forward and actually learn about it, albeit that, Ignis is really dragging you to the table at the end of the day. So I think that's why it's here. They're looking at it seriously. Wabagoon's seriously looking at it. Ignis is certainly seriously looking at it. It is our sort of, way of demonstrating the beginnings of social safety. Social safety is going to start with community volunteering. And the project, if we do decide in the north, the project of social safety does not end. We then have to show and demonstrate and build that trust that Susan was talking about, of showing that we actually are what we say we are with respect to safety at the end of the day. It is an issue that needs to be dealt with. I can't say it simpler than that. With respect to going forward, is nuclear energy a solution to our energy needs? Possibly. I think if one can project yourself into the long term, I think the ideal energy source would be nuclear fusion, which is a different type of energy, less radioactive materials, a little bit, but this may be seen at some point as a transitionary power. That's sort of my own personal thoughts on it. But I guess in the interim, or right now we're thinking, but will it become a dumping ground for all the waste? Currently, I can tell you with respect to how the community see it, Ignis and Wabagoon, they're really only considering the fuel that currently exists and the current fuel with respect to the CANDU bundles at this point in time. There are plans for SMR fuel. They would require different public containers, and there'll be some type of thing, what we call an acceptance criteria for that. So there's no guarantee that fuel will go in there at this point in time. But if it does, it will be done with the agreement of the surrounding communities thereafter.
Thank you. Yes, I think one of the reasons from my point of view as to why we're having this discussion now is because when the nuclear reactors were built originally at a cost of billions of dollars, the decision makers nor the public had any idea that this was a problem. Nuclear power was called clean energy, and people said, well, that means there's no problem. And now they're trying to make it so that the people down south who were told that there was no problem can continue to think there's no problem because the problem is going to go north. And I think that the reason we're having the discussion now is so that the nuclear industry can live up to the false assurances it gave at the beginning that this is totally clean energy. If we can get it out of sight and out of mind, then we can continue to tell people down south there's clean energy. So I think that's, now from my perspective, what I'm concerned about is that as a citizen that is concerned about this and happens to be knowledgeable about it, I was educated at public expense largely in science. I have a gold medal in mathematics and physics. I believe I have an obligation to give something back to society, back to the community. And what I can share with you is the information that this is not just one project. This is the deal that has been signed with Ignis basically says that NWMO is in the driver's seat and will be in the driver's seat in the future. Any change to the plan will be NWMO's to make, not the community. So I would hope that if Treaty 3 is going to engage in this process, that they make sure that they not only have a decision over whether it happens at all, but they also have a decision as to whether the fuel is going to be handled up here. It shouldn't be handled because the more you handle it, the more danger you have of damaging it. And contrary to what was said before, when fuel is damaged, one of these fuel bundles, you don't need to dissolve the pellets. Immediately radioactive releases occur. Immediately. If you took one of these spent fuel bundles and created a crack in it or a tear in it or a pinhole, there would immediately be radioactive releases. Not all of it would be released, but enough to be a big problem. So handling the fuel is dangerous. And handling the fuel should not be done up in Treaty 3 territory. It should be done down there. If they want to put it in burial containers, they should ship up the burial containers and not do any rehandling of the fuel. And that applies particularly to the plan, which is a very old plan, by the way, of Peter Ottensmeyer, is to reuse that energy. The only way you can reuse the energy from the used fuel is to destroy the fuel bundles. The only way you can do that is to release all the radioactive contents from the fuel bundles, and that's a far more difficult problem. And that's why in the world today, the only places where they've done a lot of, it's called reprocessing, which is recycling the plutonium from the fuel. Every single place where they've done this has turned out to be the most radioactively contaminated place. And the cost of cleanup is over $100 billion. And when I say cleanup, that just means trying to do the best job of getting rid of the radioactive stuff that has escaped. You don't want that problem here. You haven't got the advantages of the nuclear industry. Why should you have the problems?
All right, so that's it. Peter, unless you would like to respond, as you were noted.
I mean, it's very seldom, I suppose, that I agree with Gordon, but he's quoting, processing that was developed by the military, who, in a sense, don't care, but that was then made civilian at a couple of sites, and it's the same, I would say, flawed process of extracting things using what was called what's it called? Purex, a chemical process. What was done at the Argonne labs was an electro refining process. And that is specifically designed for that type of reactor. It's basically going from a metal fuel through a refiner into a metal form and then reformed as fuel. So it's smaller and much less, what should I say, diffuse in terms of the radioactive material. It's very well confined. So if you use smarts, you can do it right. But if you don't, then obviously you can contaminate a goodly area. Moreover, the Purex process is horribly expensive. More expensive than burying the stuff right now.
Okay, panelists. We are going to go on to another question. We have a lot of questions from the audience. A lot of the questions that you framed were in the same ballpark, okay? So I want to read one question in particular, and I'm not sure which of the panelists would be able to respond to this question. It's not part of the initial questions that came from members prior to this session. This question is, and I'll read it from their eye perspective, okay? Because my insurance doesn't cover nuclear accidents, who will ultimately be responsible for damages to personal property or the environment, and how much is the total coverage for? Has anyone encountered this question?
Yeah, I could give a quick answer to it and then pass it on to anybody else who wants to
Okay.
speak. It is a fact that every insurance policy in the world, in the Western world, has what's called a nuclear exclusion clause in it. And that means that if your property happens to be damaged by radioactive releases from either nuclear warfare or nuclear power, you're not covered. Your coverage is void. And for this reason, the governments who have nuclear power reactors, such as Canada, have to pass a special law saying that they will be responsible. So if you want to collect on your insurance, you're going to have to go to Ottawa and hope that the government will give you just, because you can't, your insurance company will not cover it. So what they do is they have what's called a Nuclear Liability and Compensation Act here in Canada, which limits the responsibility of the nuclear owner to a smaller amount and says that whatever's left over that needs to be compensated, the government of Canada will do. That's basically what is required with this particular industry.
That's cool.
You're good? All right. Awesome. Whoever, I hope that you're happy with the answer to that question. A lot of the questions here were framed around safety, right? Human safety, the contamination issues, the fear, that is coming through these questions about what we don't know. So there's questions surrounding safety, and there's the ideas of the unknown with this proposed DGR, having real world comparisons. What can we discuss with honesty and humility about what we don't know, including aspects such as safety, social landscape, or transportation? And would you be able to take that, Susan or Mark?
I'm happy to start. I can say a few things. Others are welcome to join in afterwards. Do you want to go first? Okay. So I think safety is such a key part here. And really the question is getting at uncertainty over long periods of time, which is a very difficult concept to wrap your mind around, right? We're dealing with timeframes, as discussed by the panelists here, that are extremely long. I think my perspective on this, I think I'm going to cause some feedback. My perspective on this is that this waste exists regardless of where it's going to end up, right? So it's currently stored at the reactor sites, and I think we all agree that it's stored safely. It's stored either in the wet bays or in these dry storage containers. People can manage this hazard. It is very hazardous, but as has been mentioned by several people up here, it is managed very safely currently. I believe that the DGR is a long-term passively safe system. And what that means is it doesn't require involvement from people to actively maintain that system. And so it's a rigorous design based on multiple independent barriers. And that those independent barriers give you confidence over long periods of time that if one of them doesn't perform exactly as you'd expect due to uncertainties from the long time frames, then you can rely on other barriers. And that's the concept of the DGR and the multiple barrier system. I also think about the alternative, which is, what if we just left the fuel on the surface? There's also uncertainties in that case. It's already in the surface environment, in the environment that you don't want to contaminate. What happens in the long term here? How much has the world changed in the last few hundred years? In the last 10 years, in the last 5 years? There's a lot of uncertainty in the world today. And I wonder about that too. I wonder, will it be safe where it currently is over a long period of time? What if there's a war? What if there's a collapse of the government? Will it be safe then where it is right now? I don't think so. And my perspective on this one is, I believe it will be much safer, deep underground, far removed from the surface environment than where it is currently stored on the surface in the environment. There's examples that have existed in the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were refueling nuclear submarines, and they were changing out the fuel rods in the submarines, and they had these at the surface. And the Soviet Union collapsed, and people just walked away from those facilities and left the environment heavily contaminated as a result. These are near the border with Finland, and the Finnish government is actually helping remediate some of these sites. So these things have happened. Things can change, and there's uncertainty no matter how you slice it. The question is, what do we think will give us the greatest assurance of safety? And we can manage it safely as we are currently. We can manage it safely in a DGR. The question is, are we willing to make that step? And I think we should do it now because it's an important thing to do. It's a hazardous material. It needs to be dealt with. And that's really where I come about it, from the perspective of uncertainty and safety over long periods of time. It's a challenging concept, and there's no easy answers. And so we have to think carefully about it from all directions. And then as a society, make a decision that makes the most sense.
Gordon, if you don't mind, Renee first, please, and we can pass it over to you if she doesn't fill the gap.
Great, thank you. So what we don't know in the short term is we don't know what the NWMO's project actually is. It's a set of concepts. I mentioned that before. So they have not yet presented a full project description of how they would actually carry this set of activities out. So I think asking communities to decide if they're willing or not, when we don't know yet what communities are being asked to be willing for. There are other unknowns, the waste types. There's been some mention of small modular reactors, different waste types, different dimensions. The limited information the NWMO has provided on their concept for the used fuel packaging plant is all based on that CANDU fuel. It's a redo for every other type of fuel. So there's lots of things that we don't know in the short term about what the activities are, how they will be carried out, and we need to know those to be able to assess what the risks are. What we do know in the medium term is that the wastes are continuing to be generated and continuing. The hottest waste has to be on surface. It has to be in the irradiated fuel bay and then in the dry storage containers. Industry has for decades been using this idea of social collapse as sort of the trump card, the real argument for why we have to accept it being buried deep in the earth, because industry says that we can't rely on society continuing to function on surface. It's this idea of war and social collapse. But industry continues to promote the idea of building more reactors. They continue to operate the reactors. They're refurbishing reactors, meaning rebuilding. So industry is quite determined that they're going to continue generating the waste for at least another 40 years, and then it has to be at the site for another 70 years. So we know in the medium term that this problem is not going to be solved by sending it 2 to 3 trucks a day, 1,600 kilometers a day, 1,600 kilometers a trip for over 50 years, because we've got another 80 years of waste still at the site. So the rush is off. This social collapse got to be more than 80 years from now, because otherwise, why would industry continue to generate this hazard, which has to be at the reactor site? In the longer term, what we don't know is the long-term performance of each of these barriers. So there's a copper container, the steel container coated with copper. That's been a debate in Sweden and Finland. 2011, the first proposal went in for Sweden, the Swedish proposal. Their copper coating is much thicker than the Canadian one, and the Lands and Environment Court has returned it again and again because of the uncertainties related to the rate of corrosion for that copper coating on that container. The Canadian design has a thinner coating, but the same issues and uncertainties are there. You can go through each of those barriers to the clay. There's a lot of uncertainty about how that clay will actually behave in a repository, because there's heat, there's radiation. The clay has to get wet to swell to act as a barrier. Industry, NWMO sometimes says it'll be dry, sometimes they say it'll be wet. Well, it'll be wet. And it has to be wet for the clay to swell to act as a barrier. But there's uncertainties about how it's going to perform given the heat and the radiation. So there's really some real unknowns about that barrier. And then we get to the geology, to the rock. Lots of uncertainty. I mean, the Canadian Shield is, it's a rich, varied, hard to predict kind of rock type. Lots of uncertainties around how will the rock perform as a barrier? Will it be a barrier? I really, I don't think we should be crediting the geology, the rock, for anything, any time in terms of acting as a means of stopping those radioactive elements from reaching surface. Because it's so hard to predict where are the fractures, where are the fissions, where and how will the releases occur, especially given those conditions in the repository where you've got heat, radiation, and gases being generated, which push things out. So there's lots of uncertainties at the beginning and the end. What's certain is that the problem is going to persist at the reactor stations. And I'd have to disagree with Mark a little bit in his description of all is well with the waste storage at the reactor station. We're a Northern Ontario group. I didn't expect to be learning as much as I've learned over the years about the waste and the way it's managed at the reactor station. But there are difficulties. There are problems with potential crowding in the irradiated fuel bay. There are deterioration in the fuel bay walls. There's tritium moving out from the sumps and from the walls at some of the reactor stations. There's unknowns around the dry storage container. They're not monitored internally. All kinds of ways, room for real improvement on the storage at the reactor station. And that's where we should focus now in the short term and the medium term, not on trying to put it deep in the earth, where it'll be unknown forever.
Thanks, Brene. One of the concerns, of course, is around the site here, this selection site. So there were some questions, Joe, you alluded to. There were many communities that had considered this, and it's here now. So there are questions about why here. If you want to share a little bit about the process, about how it ended up here. But these are questions more around the geology, and there's equivalent geological formations much closer to where the sites are and where it's presently stored. Why are the plans being made to transport to the north at the risk of environmental costs of that transportation? There's other members of the audience who are talking about this as well, around the transportation risks and the concerns of communities. Does anyone want to respond to that question about why here and why the transportation, there are so many transportation risks? The final, let me just say one last sentence here. The sensible solution is to secure it closer to where it is made and to stop producing more. ? So is it not sensible to store it closer to where it's made?
I'm going to try to describe the idea of sensible, the sensible part of the question. And the example I'm going to use is Germany, because Germany thought, getting rid of nuclear was a good idea. And they did. And what they ended up replacing that with was gas and coal. Right. And then when it came to the war in Ukraine, prices went skyrocketed and what have you. And when you look on maps showing CO2 emissions, Germany is always either brown or dark and that represents a lot of CO2 emissions. They got rid of nuclear. We have nuclear here in this province. And what we did, because we had nuclear, we got rid of coal. Right, so that was a big thing. So yeah, we chose nuclear, partly because it is a sort of made in Canada solution. We were shipping coal. We're shipping coal from Pennsylvania and out west here into the province, right? And actually shipping our wealth out of the province to buy coal. We got rid of that. We got rid of the problems with respect to asthma. I live in Southern Ontario. I used to drive into work from Niagara Falls into Ontario, and you could see that smog. We had things called smog days in Ontario. And once we got off coal, the number of smog days reduced from 50 to 60 down to 1 or 2 a year. And the number of people dying for asthma subsequently also decreased. So the reason that we do have nuclear have these other benefits, and certainly, again, very well-paying jobs, built a made-in industry for Canada, for Ontario. So there's a lot of benefits in that way. So there is some real-life benefits to why we have nuclear at the end of the day. It is very energy dense. It is one of the few industries in which knows where all its waste is. So we're talking about the high level waste. We're talking about the fuel waste. But when it comes to even the intermediate level waste or even the everyday waste of the mops and buckets and bales, we know where all that is. That all gets shipped in containers, and it's all stored currently. So it's one of those industries that actually does, move the standard of how it manages waste and knows where all its waste is. We're not polluting the environment with CO2 and that kind of stuff. Again, why Ignis? It may not be Ignis. It may be the south. So we just released our updated reports on confidence and safety, and both the rock here in the Ignis batholith and down in South Bruce, where they have sedimentary rock, both will satisfy a safety case from a technical point of view. That is our belief. And to Renee's point, yeah, we don't have all the studies done. We're at the very beginning of the process. The idea is to listen to the concerns and listen to the arguments and bring those studies forward. Right? You're right. We don't know the fracture system. So what do we have to do? We have to do a 3D seismic 3D seismic of the area to find out where all the fractures are. So you bring up a good point. You're right. We don't know where it is, but that's our challenge. You better go find them out, and you better prove to the regulator where those things are at the end of the day. And that's what we're going to be doing, right? We are early in the process. Maybe I'll just stop there.
No, don't stop, either you or Mark. Why? There's a question from someone in the audience about the NWMOs when you talk about safety in 2002, when you took over the Seaborne panel, there were 6 issues that had to be followed for the safety of people, land, and water. And this individual has asked whether you've dismissed them. Where are you at with that?
Sorry, 6 issues?
There were Seaborne panel listed 6 issues that had to be followed for the safety of people, land, and water.
Yeah, certainly. I don't know the 6 issues off the top of my head, so I would have to actually know what those particular are. I think the underlying issue is really this notion of social safety. It was even now it's a novel concept that you really need to demonstrate social acceptance, right? And again, how we interpreted social acceptance is an informed, willing host, and that's really looking for people to volunteer. Says, you know what, I'm a community that's interested in hosting. First of all, learning about it, because that's where we are, learning about it. And if it makes sense, I'm willing to go on to that journey to the next step and actually getting this thing approved. So that's how we define social safety, that there's a community willing to do it. Both municipal, non-Indigenous and Indigenous community moving forward, whether that's in the north or the south, that's to be determined at this point in time. The project that we're doing right now is, where do we go? Where do we think we have the most resilience? From a social safety point of view, will probably be the biggest criteria. Will it be the north? Will it be the south? Right, and we're determining that presently. I hope that answers the question.
Someone? I hope so too.
I don't know who else there.
I just wanted to mention that we have on my website, the CCNR website, Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. You can get it from ccnr.org, ccnr.org. And we have the whole executive summary of the report, the report of the Seaborne panel. And they do not say that social safety just means social acceptability. I think what we're confusing here is social acceptability is, say, are you willing? That's social acceptability. Social safety is whether society is safe. Going beyond just the sheer engineering part of it. And there's a whole chapter of the Seaborne Report, Chapter 5, which is devoted to social safety. And it's a much more elaborate concept than what was just suggested. It's not just a question of getting people's agreement. It's a question of whether society itself is adequately safe at this proposal. Now, I agree with many of the things. There have been mistakes made, for sure, and nobody's perfect. Accidents do happen. But by and large, the nuclear industry has been good at packaging waste and keeping them out of the environment. These packages are extraordinary. And that's why our organization believes that rolling stewardship is the best thing for the time being. Until we actually decide to stop producing the waste, we should keep the waste where it is and have these excellent people looking after it and making sure that they retrieve it, repair it. If anything starts leaking, they deal with it immediately. And that needs to be where the center of expertise is, where the political and economic clout is, down south, where they can spring into action and get those things done. We've seen examples up north here, like, Mercury in the Rainy River area and so on, where it's not been dealt with. Why? Because there's not the same economic and political clout here. But down there, if they were looking after this waste right in their own doorstep, they would continue to meet high standards of safety and they would look after it. Putting it underground and abandoning it, nobody's going to be there to look after it. Oh, sorry.
Can we, Susan, did I see you indicate that you'd like to share, and Bernayne as well?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I am not a brilliant technical mind, but what I do know is that there are brilliant technical minds. And I love the fact that there are uncertainties because the scariest thing are the unknown unknowns when you're thinking about safety. And so the more issues that are raised, even if they don't currently have a neat solution, a quick answer, that's okay. In my talk, I said sometimes things move slowly in the nuclear industry because we want to get it right. And we want to move from the unknown unknowns to the known unknowns to the known knowns. And that process takes time and it takes brilliant minds. And we have those brilliant minds in the nuclear industry and in Canada and internationally. And I think the fact that they're so early in the process and talking about these things and also talking about things that are still challenges gives me confidence because it means there's transparency about what happens and what goes on. And that should give you comfort. And I would say, yes, we still need to manage the waste that's produced at the surface, but there's no reason at the same time not to proceed with what an ultimate solution would be. Whether that's here or in the South, that's not for me to decide. But actually doing two things at once, it's not necessarily, it doesn't need to be an and or. It can be an and. And that's, to me, the smartest thing to do.
Thanks. So I think the question was why here, but Joe answered it as why nuclear. And I think we should have another evening on that, but I'll just say that efficiency, conservation, renewables are the better option. They're lower risk, more affordable, easier to dispatch, quicker to get up and running. So let's have another evening about why nuclear, why not nuclear. But why here? Here because Ignace went into the NWMO's 9-step siting process. And our assessment is that that siting process was really designed to attract communities that were vulnerable. There were 13 communities in Northern Ontario, another 6 in the shadow of the Bruce plant in Southwestern Ontario. And the communities in Northern Ontario, almost to a one, the mill was gone, the mine was gone. They were in difficult situation. And I really, our assessment is quite firmly that the NWMO's siting process was designed to bring those communities in and keep them in. A little bit of money at first, a bit more money at the next step, a bit more money at the next step. And then they gradually dropped them, some of them quite, at really inopportune times for communities right after their budgeting had been done. They thought they had another year of money coming in and then boom, they didn't. So we could talk a lot more about the siting process as well and why communities are being asked to make this compelling demonstration of willingness, step 5, before step 6, the environmental assessment, before step 7, the environmental assessment, before step 8, when the site characterization is done. It's just the wrong sequence. So that's why here, because Ignace went to a conference at Thunder Bay and found out about the $16 to $24 billion national infrastructure project. Would your community like to learn more about how you can benefit? That's what the communities were presented with. And so 13 of them put their hands up in Northern Ontario. I want to just finish with the Seaborne Commission. The Seaborne Commission, the Seaborne panel, they ran that environmental assessment in the 1990s on the previous proposal by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. And they came out with an excellent set of recommendations. The first one was that the future steps should be taken by an independent agency, arm's length from industry. The next one was, using the language of the day, a framework for the participation of Aboriginal people should be developed by Aboriginal people themselves. And the federal government said, thank you very much. There were some others, several excellent recommendations. The federal government said, thank you very much. we accept your recommendations in principle. And then they created the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, which did something very different and put the industry in charge, said to the industry, organize yourselves as a waste management organization. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization emerged, an association of the waste owners, producers, those nuclear power companies. The Seaborne Commission, some Seaborne panel members actually went to the parliamentary committee hearings and the Senate committee hearings and voiced their criticism of the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act. So I think that if we're going to talk about the Seaborne Commission, we need to talk about their recommendations as a set, and we need to talk about their criticisms of the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act and their disagreement with putting the nuclear industry in charge.
Thank you, Bernine. Susan. I'll move into, I'm going to take a different road here for a moment. And there was a question from the audience, as well as some of the folks from Treaty 3 territory that prepared some questions ahead of time. And it's around alternative approaches. And you heard a presentation from Peter about, is there a recycling and repurposing process for nuclear waste? So he shared his insights with that. One of the individuals in the audience here asked Peter, and anyone else who wants to respond to that, why is the nuclear industry pushing the small modular nuclear reactors when they still have not solved the world's nuclear waste problem? So do you want to tackle that question, Peter, or anyone else? So it's a flip the script kind of thing here, what Peter presented to us about recycling and repurposing, and the individual's question around why are we pushing for more when we haven't solved the nuclear waste problem in the world?
Well, I myself have been challenging the nuclear industry as to why they're going into small modular reactors. Part of that is, of course, the realization that we need more electrical power, and how do you get that? Ontario is just about maxed out in terms of hydro. Renewables like wind and solar are too unreliable without backup. The backup is either nuclear or it's gas. Gas is considered to be, a CO2 producing deleterious substance. And so that leaves us with nuclear. Now, nuclear basically is considered to be always over budget and over time. And the idea of going into small reactors was that we will demonstrate, I consider the nuclear industry, that we can build the thing on time and on budget. And that's what they're trying to do right now. And then, of course, the COP28 came along and said, look, we really should triple nuclear energy in the world.
That's not COP28, I'm sorry. COP28 said triple renewables by 2050, not nuclear.
Okay, the nuclear industry considered that to be a signal to triple nuclear. Well, so they're trying. And the easiest way to go into this is with a small step, which is a small modular reactor. So, certainly Bruce is considering larger reactors right now, but OPG is going ahead with a small one. So is NB Power, New Brunswick Power. And the idea is that they want to demonstrate that they can do it on time and on budget.
Yeah, the nuclear industry has been in trouble for the last 25 years. Their share of global electricity has been declining. It's gone from about 17% 25 years ago of global electricity supply down to less than 10% today. And the whole talk about small modular reactors is an effort of the nuclear industry to revitalize the nuclear option. And they have got Canada interested in this because they see it as a politically advantageous thing, because they've already invested a lot of money in nuclear. But in fact, at the COP28 is the climate change conference, I think you know. The COP28 conference actually came out with a statement supported by 145 countries that renewable energy should be tripled by 2050. There was a small group of countries, 22 of them, that put forward a statement that we should double nuclear by 2030, if I'm not mistaken. But no, not by 2030, by 2050. But that was not a conclusion of the COP conference. They did not adopt that. That was simply done by these other countries on the occasion of the COP28 conference. So the COP28 conference did not make such a recommendation. They did recommend that renewables be tripled. And renewables, in fact, are now shown quite clearly to be expanding far more rapidly, the most rapidly expanding energy source around the world. In fact, the International Energy Agency has said that in the next 5 years, 90% of all new electricity installations around the world will be renewable. 90% of them. So that's they're doing very well right now. Nuclear has not been doing very well, and they're trying to do better. That's why the small modular reactors are being promoted.
I just wanted to add one small thing. And Nuclear Waste Management Organization is responsible for management of nuclear waste. We're agnostic to what the industry does. I think if the Canada decides to go 100% renewable, personally, great. That's fine with me. That would be wonderful, because that means carbon emitting electricity would be a thing of the past. There's technical challenges there. There's technical challenges no matter what the proposal is. I think the big takeaway in my mind, though, to keep things focused back on nuclear waste, is that this waste exists. It is already produced. If you stop nuclear today, closed every reactor, there's still lots of waste to be dealt with. And so we need to think about how are we going to deal with that. And then really that's the purpose of the discussions here today.
Hey, you're going to get the mic anyway, because
Okay.
Joe, this will be the last question. All of these individuals will make themselves available to you in the future if you want to contact any of them for specific questions you might have. I didn't ask them that. I'm assuming they will. So if there is more you want to learn from any one of them or all of them, please tap them on the shoulder. There's one last question. Gordon.
Yeah, just be suggested that our emails be posted on the website so that anybody can find out what our emails are.
That's a thumbs up. There's just one last question, and this question, we've been hearing a lot about the science of things, about some of the concerns around safety, and even dipping into, insurance-specific questions. But we haven't talked about traditional laws and knowledge systems, and whether they've been factored into the unfolding process of this adaptive phase management project. So where should traditional knowledge be fitting into this project, and where have there been gaps, Joe?
So it's quite interesting, Brene. I'm going to have to, give you credit for educating me about one of the recommendations about Indigenous inclusion into this project. Not knowing that, but also knowing at the same time when the NWMO was formed in 2003, we actually reached out and sought elders right across Canada, and actually formed an elders committee. And now it's an elders sort of conference or committee that we have, and we've had that group there since 2003 to the present, going on 21 years. And they provided us advice and guidance on how to move forward. And out of that, we had NWMO has its own, obviously Indigenous policy, and I think a lot of large corporations have that. We also have Indigenous knowledge policy that instructs us to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into decision making. We have a reconciliation policy that really speaks to how we're going to deal with reconciliation both internally and externally. And then more recently, we have put out a water statement with respect to our commitment to protecting water. So that's NWMO. With respect to the communities in which we work, certainly we're here today in Grand Council Treaty 3. We recognize that Grand Council Treaty 3 is the traditional government for this territory, and they have their own laws, as we heard from Mona. And one of them is Manituaki and Nakagawan, the Great Earth Law. And we are currently working with the TPU to look at how that will be incorporated into our project if it does move forward at the end of the day, similar to some of the other projects here in the area. We also recognize that each individual community may have their own processes and are committed, at the time when the time's appropriate, to follow those own community processes also. We also have outreach programs. So we just not reached out to Ignis and Wabigoon. Like I said, we've also reached out to, I think 13 other communities around here, and have an open invitation for any community to want to learn more about the project to come learn more about the project and incorporate their thoughts into our decision making at the end of the day. Even if their starting position is no, I think the Grand Chief made a good point that if the decision is going to be no, as long as it's an informed no, I think we're good. I think I've done my job. If the community has said no, and I know it's an informed no. They've taken all the facts that were provided, took those in and says, what, just, for whatever the overall reason is no. So I think that's how we're doing at this point. So that's sort of the program that we're doing. The other thing is the communities themselves. I can tell you, in particular, Wabigoon, and it's really for Wabigoon to speak to this, is that they have done their own internal processes with respect to traditional knowledge of, anytime that we're on the land, they're on the land with us. They done their own ceremony. This whole project started on ceremony, and this project would have not moved forward without Wabigoon doing the ceremony, make sure they did it. And this project hung in that ceremony. We would not have moved forward unless, we didn't do that ceremony. So again, that's for Wabigoon to speak to. And we continue to seek advice from the Council of Elders, that's what we call them. They instruct us that they're saying to us is, Joe, what have you done today to protect Mother Earth? That's what they keep saying to us. What are you doing to protect Mother Earth? And that's why I'm here. I'm Indigenous. I didn't mention my background. I'm Hongwe, so I'm part of the Haudenosaunee from Oneida Nation of the Thames. I got my teachings from a gentleman named Tommy Porter. So I have a good sense of, who I am as in my identity. And yeah, I'm Indigenous, and, I'm out here trying to, do a very difficult job and give you my life experience working in the nuclear industry and why I think this is a very good industry to bring to your territory. But I do that because, one of the things that's really important to me is that we deal with the issues today. That I benefit for this. I don't want to push this off into my kids. And we've already done that with global warming. We've already pushed that on to our kids. I don't have to deal with global warming. I'm not going to be on this earth that long to see the impacts, but some of the youth in here will be. And that's our fault. That's our fault for using gas and coal and those other things. We did that. We polluted the environment, right? We did that. And we pushed that on. So, I don't want to push this other issue onto the future generations. And that's why I do what I do at the end of the day. So I take my own sensibilities with respect to traditional knowledge and my own teachings and try to bring it and try to, explain to communities. And I get it. People come to these things outraged, upset, angry. And in some ways, you need to have, I can understand why you're angry, because there's just so much unknown about what we do in our industry. It really is a mystery. And if we can even make that small step of actually trying to provide enough information to say, hey, maybe I should look at this. Maybe there is something here that I really haven't considered fully. I think I've done my job at the end of the day. And I really encourage everybody to learn about the project, and certainly, incorporating Indigenous knowledge into it will be a big part of what we're trying to do going forward. So I'll leave it to others who want to speak.
I will just say, this is your wrap-up time. We're going to let this audience go. If you want to capture any one of them before they get out of the door, you can do so. But you have a couple of minutes here, please, to say your thank yous to this audience and whatever it is you want to say in your wrap-up, please.
Well, of course, a big thank you, and my privilege to be here in my first time in Treaty 3 territory. So thank you for the kindness and the welcome and the invitation. I'm an ordinary person who had what I think is an extraordinary opportunity to work in the nuclear industry. And I worked in areas like safety culture, where I got to peek under the covers and ask difficult questions and be ornery, and assure myself, as well as help the industry to continually improve on safety. I'm a big believer in human ingenuity and the extraordinary things that people will come up with and invent and solve. I look to flight. So the Wright brothers, the time between the Wright brothers flying the first airplane to putting man on the moon was 66 years. That's incredible. That's technically complex. And so I believe that nuclear has benefits. I believe that nuclear is well run. I believe that the waste is well managed. And I believe that a permanent facility for its disposal makes a lot of sense. And I think we should proceed with that somewhere. I'd love it to be in my community. I live close to South Bruce. I think there's a lot of economic advantages to that. But, it's a tremendous opportunity that you have to consider this opportunity. And I do believe that being part of this and asking the questions and assuring yourself, the fact that the process enables that and the fact that there is this transparency is something that's very unique compared to any other industry. And that should give you comfort for whatever is decided, what happens with the waste and what happens with nuclear. Maybe there'll be a new technology that comes along. If we can put man on the moon in 66 years from flight, who knows what's going to happen in 66 years when it comes to energy. Unfortunately, I probably won't be around to see it. Thank you so much.
So thank you all for being in this conversation. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here, and you've all been very, attentive and engaged. And I know that's hard when you've got a whole bunch of people who talk for maybe longer than they were told to, sitting at the front of the room. So thank you so much for that. It's a really big conversation, and it's been thrust upon us in Treaty 3 territory and all the northern treaty areas. It's been thrust upon us, and we've had to go through it. And I'm happy to continue to talk. I'm happy to come to your community, to visit your community. I've spent time in many of the communities already, to come back and have more conversations with Treaty 3. I'm so grateful for the invitation. I've got on the table a little bit of literature. Look out, the phone number's wrong on the transportation card. And there's a sign-in sheet. If you want to be on our contact list, we don't share the list for any purpose other than talking about nuclear waste and nuclear risk as it relates to Northern Ontario. So I just want to say thank you, and I hope to be in a continued conversation with all of you.
And I think I'll continue with the thank yous as well. And I think it's really been an honor to be here. It's been a privilege, and it's been a very interesting evening. I really appreciate all the participation from the audience. I hope that by me being here, you can put a face to one of these technical people that are out here. I assure you, I'm doing my absolute very best to ensure a DGR will be safe. This is my career. It's what I've spent all my time learning and studying and working on. And really, I hope that you walk away with an understanding of what we're coming here to do, which is really to give you the opportunity to ask us questions and to learn more about this project. The process is voluntary to select a site. Yes, Treaty 3 was brought in through the involvement of Ignace and Wabigoon, but this is a conversation that we're having. I'm happy to talk about it. I'm glad that you're here to talk about it. And really, the site selection is not the end of the process. It's really the start of a very long, rigorous technical licensing process that then starts afterwards. And so there's still a long way to go from here. If it's in the north, if it's in the south, that's still to be decided. And that's in part to be decided with input from folks like you. So thank you for having us here, and thank you for listening.
are going to be short. First of all, I just want to congratulate everyone. So it's 10 o'clock on a Thursday evening. So stick around. So it's to you guys. So I just want to thank you for listening to us. And again, I just encourage everybody to continue to learn about the project. Again, one last thing I'll say. We're very early in the process. We've heard of the concept of free, prior, informed consent. This truly is prior. We don't even have a project yet, right? And we're looking to make a site selection. Then we're going to file an initial project description, probably sometime in 2025. That's when it truly starts. That's when the real rigorous dialogue is going to happen, and certainly there's going to be more of these types of gatherings, as if whether it's the north or the south, happening. So again, congratulations for sticking around. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, I too am very thankful for being here, and I appreciate the invitation so much from Treaty 3 to participate in this. I am concerned that people not put themselves at a disadvantage. And if they're asked to give willing consent, I don't think they should give blanket consent for eternity for decisions to be changed and new aspects of the project to be opened up. Unfortunately, the agreement with Ignace that's already signed does exactly that. It basically says that the future town councils will not say anything negative about the project, no matter what NWMO does to alter the project. They may modify the project as it goes forward. So I do believe that there should be protections built in that the community can revisit their approval and say, well, we approved to this, but we're not going to approve to that. So there should be a stepwise provision so that any new modification proposed by NWMO should be open also for the willingness of the community to accept those modifications. So that's one of my concerns for being here. I also am, in my own personal opinion, I think it's a shame that the industry itself says it's quite safe where it is. They say it's not an urgent problem. They could manage the waste as they are for 100 years, 200 years, where it is, without difficulty, really. And these wastes are not as old as I am. These wastes are less than 80 years old. I'm over 80 years old. So I think that it doesn't make sense. It's a dirty, dangerous distraction from things we could be doing and spending our money more wisely, combating climate change by building renewables in these communities, building opportunities through building renewables up here in the north, and so on. That would be a forward-looking thing, and very much in the line of directly fighting climate change. Burying the waste underground is not going to do anything to fight climate change. It's just simply going to, in fact, it's going to cause more carbon emissions. All the transportation, putting it underground, all of that is going to lead to a lot of carbon emissions. We'd be better off leaving the waste where they are, not adding to those carbon emissions, and building renewables in communities that could really profit from that. Anyway, that's my point of view. Thank you very much for having me here.
I would also like to say thank you. This is my third trip up into your territory, and I've enjoyed every one of them. As a final word, I want you to consider that nuclear energy from a single atom, heavy atom that is split, gives you about 40 million times more energy than burning a carbon atom. So I think it's something which is marvelous in terms of what man has discovered, even though nature was there before that and had reactors millions of years ago, natural reactors. And so if you look at what is called nuclear waste, as I tried to point out, it still has over 99% heavy atoms in it, which also are 40,000 times better than burning a carbon atom per atom. Consider that. I don't consider that waste. I think our human ingenuity in going as far as we have and also ferreting out reactions that we can follow in the future because they've already been demonstrated in the past is something that should not be thrown away. And so I would consider embracing nuclear energy and bringing it north. Whether you do the processing in the south, that's fine with me. Maybe you can cooperate with each other, or we can cooperate with each other. But I certainly feel that you can use that energy because energy changes your standard of living. Energy makes life possible, makes life beautiful. Without it, we may go back to this, was it 17th century when we had windmills and we had horse-drawn carriages and so forth, which is almost what you can predict if you go into the merely renewable state, because we were there before. So look at nuclear energy as something which is really terrific. Its bane is that it started in our consciousness with two major explosions in Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we've been fighting that image ever since. But that's military progress, if you want to call it, background. The civilian aspect of it, I think, is really powerful, and it is not as dangerous as you think because we can think. We can find out what to do to protect you and protect our grandchildren. But if we don't give them the energy, then our grandchildren will suffer. So embrace nuclear energy. Do something with it. You have the brains to protect yourself because there's nothing easier than measuring radiation. I normally have a Geiger counter with me, and even right now in this building, it would go click, 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 because we live in a sea of radiation, and we will always live in a sea of radiation. Uranium has such a long half-life that it will be there for another set of billions of years. It's good stuff.
Thanks, Peter. All right, Mona, you started things off and you're about to close it off, but we can give them a round of applause for their courage, for coming up here. And I hope when you leave here today, you feel like you learned something different or you were validated with what you felt when you came in. So I'm going to pass this mic over to Mona, who has been very patient.
Thank you. I just like, on behalf of Treaty 3, I would like to thank all of you for attending and presenting your information to our citizens. I won't be doing a closing prayer. because this work will continue. So I'll be speaking to these tobacco ties and the food offerings at sunrise tomorrow morning. And the work that our nation and our team needs to continue. So we won't be closing that off. Bill Prano has left it open in Dryden, and Priscilla Samard has left it open in Fort Francis. So we will continue to leave this open. So we won't be closing it because the work is going to continue. Grand Council's work needs to continue, so we won't be closing anything off with any closing prayer or anything like that. But we will ask that our offerings are well received and that they clear that path so we can continue doing the work in a good way in the best interests of our Mother Earth and our water and humanity as a whole. Miigwech.